Says murdered, Amelia. Says murdered, Lyriel. Says murdered, Altair. Says murdered, Hadar. Says murdered, Mateo. Says murdered, Aiden. Says murdered, Akernar. Says murdered, Elijah. Says murdered, Sirius. Says murdered, Sebastian. Says murdered, Ellie. Says murdered, Acrox, Sophia. Says murdered, Mason. Says murdered, Grayson. Says murdered, Gakrix. Says murdered, Riley. Says murdered, Lyriel. Says murdered, Lily, Harper. Says murdered, Oliver. Power out, requested by Deneb. Power restored, requested by Mila. Says murdered, Akernar. Says murdered, Sebastian. Power out, requested by. Says murdered, Jackson. Says murdered, Regulus. Says murdered, Hadar. Power restored, requested by Subra Orbis. Says murdered, William.